A house that never sleeps, the killings that never end. Hook. What if the house you walk into isn't just a building, but a living, breathing entity, hungering for your soul? Step inside and uncover the horrifying truth that awaits. But beware, once you enter, you may never leave. Stay with us to uncover the darkest secrets of this never-ending nightmare. The wind howled through the trees. A gust rattled the window. The room felt colder. He could see his breath, barely visible in the dark. His heart raced. Every creak in the house made him flinch. The silence seemed thick. A tension lingered. He rubbed his arms, trying to shake the chill. His eyes darted around. There was something wrong. Something off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Was it just the wind? He didn't think so. A soft thud echoed upstairs. His pulse quickened. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. Too heavy. The air felt dense. He stepped closer to the door. Should he check? His hand hovered over the handle. Just a moment of hesitation. But it felt wrong to ignore it. He opened the door slowly. The hallway stretched out, dark and narrow. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He took a step, then another. Something was moving. A shadow flickered at the top of the stairs. He froze. The shadow didn't move. But he could feel its presence. His breath caught. He had to know what it was. One step at a time. Creak. The staircase groaned beneath him. A whisper broke the silence. Faint. Barely audible. He leaned in, straining to hear. It came again. A slow, deliberate whisper. His pulse raced faster now. Leave. The voice was low. Cold. Chilled him to the bone. He felt it in his gut. Something was waiting. The whisper echoed again. Leave. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. A shadow loomed at the top of the stairs. He couldn't see it clearly. But it was there. He stepped back. A cold gust brushed his skin. His heart thundered. And then it happened. A scream. Sharp. Unimaginable. It echoed from above. The walls seemed to tremble. He couldn't move. The floor beneath him seemed to crack. A weight pressed on his chest. The air grew thick. He gasped for air. The scream came again. Closer. Louder. And then silence. A silence so deep it shook him. He dared to look up. The shadow was gone. But something still lingered in the air. Something cold. Something watching. His legs were frozen. He had to leave. But he didn't know how. The door slammed shut behind him. A laugh, faint but distinct, echoed through the house. He was trapped. The walls seemed to close in. His breath came in shallow gasps. The air felt thick, oppressive. He turned, frantically searching for an escape. There was nothing but darkness. Nothing but silence. The laugh echoed again. This time, it was closer. His eyes scanned the room. The shadows seemed to stretch. Warping, twisting. He felt eyes on him. From the corners, from the dark. His feet moved, but they felt heavy. Like the floor itself was trying to hold him back. Another whisper. Soft. A chilling, mocking tone. Where will you go? He froze. His blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It came from everywhere. A rustle, a scraping sound behind him. He turned around quickly. Nothing. Nothing but the shadowed walls. He felt it again. That pressure, like something was pushing him down. Making it hard to breathe. A soft thud from the stairs. Then another. And then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Each step a promise. A promise of something terrible. Closer. Closer still. He wanted to run. But his legs refused to move. The footsteps were almost on top of him. He could feel the heat of it. A presence. A dark weight. The silence broke. The floorboard beneath him cracked. He stumbled forward. The air turned freezing. He could hear a low hum now. A deep vibration in the walls. He had to move. He reached for the door. But it was locked. He tugged. The lock rattled. It wouldn't give. The footsteps were almost there. The laughter came again. It echoed in his mind. A mocking, cruel sound. Stay with us. The door wouldn't open. He pounded on it desperately. His hand, slick with sweat, slipped. The pressure grew. The air was suffocating. He gasped for breath. There was no way out. No escape. The footsteps were at the door. He couldn't move. He couldn't even scream. Then silence. A crushing silence. His heart thudded in his chest. The door creaked open slowly. Just a crack. He could see the outline of something standing in the dark. Its form was twisted, unnatural. Eyes gleaming, glowing in the black. And then it spoke again. Now you stay. The door inched open further. He couldn't move. His legs numb, like they were made of stone. A cold breeze rushed past him. But the air was thick, oppressive. The figure in the doorway was clearer now. It stood tall. Too tall. A shape that seemed to bend the shadows. Eyes gleaming, piercing. A grotesque smile stretched across its face. It didn't blink. It didn't need to. Every inch of him screamed to run. But his body was frozen in place. The figure took a step forward. Its movements slow, deliberate. Closer. Closer still. The smile widened. And then it whispered. Don't you want to know what's inside? The words sliced through the air. They were cold, harsh. His throat tightened. He couldn't swallow. He couldn't breathe. His vision blurred. The walls around him seemed to close in. The house itself felt like it was alive. Like it was breathing with him. The figure stepped into the room. It was so close now. Its breath cold against his skin. The eyes. They were endless. Like voids. Like they could swallow him whole. Stay, it said again. The whisper was louder this time. The floor beneath him shifted. A creak, deep and heavy. He wanted to scream. But no sound escaped his lips. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable. His vision was darkening. The room around him spinning. The figure loomed closer, impossibly close now. Its cold breath brushing his ear. Stay forever, it murmured. He could feel the weight of its words. Like they were suffocating him. The air grew thick with an unspoken promise. A promise of endless, consuming darkness. He struggled, his arms shaking, his chest tight. But he was trapped. Helpless. The walls, the shadows, they all seemed to close in tighter. His eyes began to close. The darkness, it was all-consuming now. And then a voice. Faint. From far away. Leave, now! But it was too late. The voice faded into nothing. The darkness swallowed it whole. He couldn't tell if it was real. His mind was slipping, falling deeper. The figure was still there. Its presence was overwhelming. It stood in front of him, unblinking. A twisted, silent sentinel. A cold wind rushed through the room. It felt like ice cutting through his skin. The air was thick with dread. His body screamed to escape. But his feet wouldn't move. His heart hammered in his chest. The figure leaned closer. Its breath chilled him to the core. Forever, it whispered again. He could feel it, pulling him in. Like gravity, like a force beyond understanding. The world around him blurred. The edges of his vision darkened. Was he dying? Was this it? He tried to call out. But no sound came. It was as if his very voice had been stolen. The figure's smile grew wider. Unnaturally wide. He felt its fingers brush his arm. Cold. Hard. And then, something changed. A flicker in the dark. A soft glow from the corner of the room. A crack in the shadow. The figure paused. Its smile faltered, just for a moment. For a fleeting second, it seemed unsure. Then the crack in the darkness widened. The light grew, pulsing. A desperate hope, something stirring deep inside him. He strained, reaching for it. The figure moved quicker now. Its hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. Cold fingers, unyielding. But something shifted. He yanked his arm free. A surge of energy, of panic. His body moved on its own. He stumbled backward, away from the figure. The light grew brighter. It was no longer just a glow. It was a beacon. A sliver of hope. He ran. Faster. Toward the light. The air around him twisted. The shadows clawed at his heels. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The light was right there. Almost within reach. And then, with a burst of strength, he dove into it. The darkness screamed behind him. But it was too late. The light enveloped him. A blinding, searing force. And then, silence. Utter silence. He opened his eyes. The room was empty. The house was still. No figure. No shadows. Just nothing. He was alone. Breathing. Free. But deep inside, he could still feel the presence. Lingering. Waiting. Watching. He stood in the silence. His breath shaky. The weight of the air still pressing on him. The house still. But somehow not quite right. He looked around. The light was dim now. Barely flickering. The walls seemed to bend and pulse. Like they were alive. He couldn't shake the feeling. That something wasn't over. That something still waited. He moved cautiously. His footsteps echoing in the stillness. The floor creaked under his weight. But the house was no longer hostile. No shadows stalking him. No figure lurking in the dark. But it wasn't the same. The air was thick with a sense of dread. A sense that something was watching. Something unseen. Something that knew he had escaped. He walked slowly through the house. Each room, each corner felt empty. But not truly empty. A hollow feeling lingered. The house had breathed with him. And now it was breathing again. But more faintly. He turned a corner. And the temperature dropped sharply. A cold so biting it stung. The shadows stretched unnaturally long. He froze. His eyes scanning the room. Then he saw it. A figure. A silhouette in the far corner. Too still. Too perfect. It was watching him. Not moving. Just staring. He couldn't see its face. But he felt its gaze. Sharp. Like needles pricking his skin. He took a step back. His pulse racing again. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. It didn't need to. The pressure built in the room. The air thickened once more. Then, a whisper. "Did you think you could leave?" The words came from everywhere. His throat tightened. The figure stepped forward. It was closer now. Closer than before. His eyes widened. But he couldn't move. It reached out. Cold fingers brushed his cheek. "Stay." The whisper was louder now. More insistent. He could feel it. Like the walls closing in on him again. His heart raced. No. He couldn't stay. He wouldn't stay. But the figure moved faster now. It was everywhere. A presence that consumed the room. The walls felt like they were pressing against him. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Then, the whisper again. "Forever." The figure was right in front of him. And this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was real. A twisted, deformed shape. Its eyes were endless pits. Its smile a jagged line of teeth. And it whispered again. "Stay with me." The room seemed to shudder. The darkness closed in. He was trapped. He couldn't escape. The last breath he took was cold. And everything went black. He woke to the sound of nothing. No whispers. No shadows. No cold breath. Just stillness. But it wasn't peaceful. His heart pounded in his chest. A dull ache in his head. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his vision. The room was different now. The walls, the floor, everything had shifted. It looked the same. But the air felt wrong. He felt heavy. Trapped. He stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. The floor creaked underfoot. But it felt like he was walking on something more solid. More real. The house no longer felt alive. It felt dead. Empty. He moved cautiously through the hallway. Each step echoed in the silence. It was unnerving. The house had been full of life. Or something like it. But now it was hollow. A shell. He came to the staircase. The steps were worn. But they seemed sturdy. He reached out. Touching the railing. It was cold, smooth. Like it had been untouched for years. He began to ascend. Each step felt like it carried him further away from the horror. Further from the shadow that had tried to pull him in. But as he reached the top, the air shifted again. A faint sound. A click. A door creaking open. He froze. The house was still. He was alone. Wasn't he? He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dark hallway. And then, he saw it. A door at the far end of the hall. Ajar. A sliver of light spilling through. It wasn't there before. He could feel it. A presence. He had to know what was behind that door. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe curiosity. But he had to know. He moved toward it. Each step was deliberate. His breath shallow. His heart pounding in his ears. The door was open just enough. The light from inside spilled into the hallway. He could hear something. A soft whisper. Faint, like it was calling to him. He reached for the doorknob. Hesitated. His skin tingled. But the whisper grew louder. Come closer. He couldn't resist. He twisted the knob. The door creaked open wider. A strange warmth hit him. But it wasn't comforting. It was wrong. The room was glowing with an unnatural light. The walls shimmered. Like liquid. And in the center of the room. There it was. A figure. But not the same one. This one was different. It was waiting. It didn't speak. It just watched him. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised its hand. A finger pointing toward him. Stay, it said. Its voice cold. And this time, he knew there was no escaping. The figure's finger trembled slightly. But the command was clear. Stay. The word echoed in his mind. Louder than the heartbeat pounding in his chest. He froze. His body refused to move. The room pulsed with light. Unearthly and heavy. His breath was shallow. His limbs stiff. As if the very air was holding him in place. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was a presence that filled the room. His eyes locked on it. On the motionless shape. Something deep within him screamed to run. To escape. But the word, the whisper, held him captive. The warmth of the room twisted into a suffocating heat. His skin burned. He could feel it. The weight of the figure's gaze pulling at him. He couldn't tear his eyes away. And then it spoke again. Slowly, almost gently. You are mine now. The room seemed to close in. The walls bending. The ceiling pressing down. A thick fog crept in from the corners. Curling around his feet. Seeping into his lungs. He gasped. But the air was dense. Almost liquid. Every breath felt like drowning. The figure's eyes, those empty, endless pits, burned into him. A stare that felt like it was tearing through his soul. He could feel his mind splintering. Pieces of him being pulled apart. The fog thickened. Its grasp tightening around him. Stay with me, the figure whispered. The words tangled in his mind. Like vines wrapping around his thoughts. Squeezing. He opened his mouth to scream. But no sound came. His body felt foreign. Heavy. Like it wasn't his own. Then, as the fog consumed him, his vision began to blur. He couldn't see. He couldn't think. Only that oppressive weight. The figure, the darkness. And the whispers? Suddenly, the light flashed brighter, blinding him. A sharp, painful brightness. But before he could react, the figure's voice cut through the haze. You are no longer who you were. The fog swirled. And then, nothing. Complete silence. He was gone. But somewhere, deep in the house, the light still pulsed. And the figure, now satisfied, waited. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. No movement. No sound. The house stood still, as though time had stopped altogether. But deep within its walls, something shifted. A whisper, barely audible, like the faintest breeze stirring in a dark room. The light flickered again, briefly, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then, for the first time in what felt like eternity, a sound. A soft footstep. Another. A hesitant shuffle. Slow and uncertain. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The figure in the center of the room remained still, its gaze unwavering. It could sense the change. The house had started to breathe again, its pulse quickening. Something was stirring. Something was waking. The footfalls grew louder, closer. The air grew thicker, charged with a sense of impending dread. The figure tilted its head, its gaze fixed on the source of the sound. A shadow emerged from the edge of the room, its form twisted, unnatural. The figure took a step back, watching. The shadows parted, and there, standing in the doorway, was a shape, a figure. But it wasn't the same. This one was different. Its eyes were wide, staring in horror at the figure in the center of the room. A reflection? A piece of the past? It stumbled forward, unsteady on its feet. It was him. The man who had once been trapped in this nightmare. But now, his eyes were vacant, hollow, a reflection of what he had become. And the whispers returned, louder now. Join us, they said. Stay with us. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The figure before him raised its hand. A beckoning gesture. The light flickered one last time. And as he moved closer, he could feel it, the pull. The grip of the house. The weight of its hunger. He reached out. A reflex. It was inevitable. He was no longer himself. He was part of it now. The house. The figure. They were all one. And with a single step, he crossed the threshold. The darkness embraced him. And the cycle began anew. The house waited. Silent. Alive. The house stood still once more. But there was a shift. A subtle tremor ran through the walls. A faint hum vibrated in the air. The figure in the center of the room remained motionless, its eyes locked on the new arrival. It didn't need to speak. It didn't need to move. The house would do the rest. The man, now one with the darkness, felt the change deep within. His body, once his own, no longer responded to him. He could feel the house's hunger, its thirst for more. And in the corner of his mind, a faint whisper remained. Stay. The walls seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart, as if the house was feeding off his fear, feeding off the remnants of who he had been. The figure, no longer a shadow, now moved toward him, its form distorted, like it was both there and not there at the same time. It reached out, its fingers cold and impossibly long. It touched his shoulder. He felt nothing. But he knew. He knew that it was the beginning of something darker. The warmth of the house wrapped around him like a suffocating embrace. His mind felt distant, almost fading. He could still see the faintest flicker of his past self. But it was slipping away, like smoke in the wind. The figure whispered once more. Forever. And as the final remnants of his free will crumbled, he understood. There was no escape. There was no way out. He had become part of the house. A new presence. A new figure in its endless, shifting corridors. The house was alive. And it was hungry. Always hungry. Waiting for the next soul to cross its threshold. A new whisper joined the others. Stay. The cycle would never end. Not for him. Not for anyone. The house groaned. Its walls shifting. Its heartbeat growing louder. The man, now lost to the darkness, could still hear the faint whispers. Faint memories of who he once was. But they were fading. Disintegrating like dust. He could feel the house wrap its cold fingers around his thoughts. Everything was slipping away. The warmth of the room pulsed like a living thing. It felt familiar now. Comforting. And yet still oppressive. Still cold. He looked down at his hands. But they weren't his anymore. They were something else. Something twisted. Shapeless. The figure before him watched him intently. Its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. It was waiting. Watching. He knew what it wanted. The house wanted him to stay. To become part of it. To feed its hunger. And there was no way out. Not anymore. The doors were shut. The windows sealed. Every path led deeper into the house. There was no escape from the cycle. He could feel it in his bones now. A bone-deep understanding. This was how it worked. This was how it always worked. And the whispers? They grew louder. Closer. Join us. Stay. He tried to scream. But his voice was gone. Lost somewhere in the thick fog of the house. The figure's face remained blank. Expressionless. But there was a promise in its eyes. A promise that he was now part of the house. Forever. The shadows moved around him. Wrapping themselves around his body. Pulling him into their embrace. The walls seemed to stretch. Growing tighter. Smaller. He could no longer tell where he began. And where the house ended. It had all become one. He had become one with it. And somewhere, deep within, he felt a spark of what he used to be. A flicker of resistance. But it was too late. The house had already claimed him. And soon, the whispers would find another. Another soul to join the endless cycle. The door was always open. Waiting. And it would always be hungry. The air grew colder. The walls groaned again. As though the house itself was shifting. Shaping itself around the new presence. The man's thoughts had become fractured. Slipping away like water through his fingers. He could feel the house inside him. Its pulse syncing with his own. It was feeding. Growing stronger with each passing second. He could no longer tell where he ended. And the house began. The whispers grew louder. More urgent. Stay. Stay with us forever. He wanted to resist. He wanted to scream. But his voice was swallowed by the house's hunger. The darkness around him seemed to swirl. Twisting into forms he couldn't understand. Shapes that were once familiar. His own hands, his own face, had become distorted. Lost in the dark. His body felt like it wasn't his own. Like it was being pulled. Twisted. Shaped by the house's will. But there was no escaping it now. The house had him. And it would not let go. The walls pressed in. Tightening around him. He could feel the weight of it. The crushing force of the house's desire. Pulling him deeper into its grasp. And then, through the suffocating silence, he felt something. Something strange. A presence. Not the house. Not the figure. But something else. Faint at first. Like a flicker in the dark. A small, desperate light. Fighting to survive. It was a memory. A spark of something that had once been. He clung to it. Fighting to hold on to what he had been. What he had lost. But the house was relentless. It was everywhere. It was his every breath. Every thought. The light flickered again. A brief moment of clarity. Could he escape? Was there still a way out? But before he could answer, The darkness surged. The walls roared to life, closing in around him. The whispers became a cacophony, rising to a deafening pitch. Stay! It was no longer a request. It was a command. And in that moment, he realized there was no escaping. There never had been. He had never been free. The house had always owned him. And now, he was part of it. A piece of its endless hunger. The light disappeared, snuffed out by the weight of the darkness. And in the silence that followed, the house waited, as it always would, for the next soul, the next whisper, the next one to cross the threshold. It was patient. It was hungry. And it would never stop. The silence was thick now. A heavy, oppressive weight that filled every corner of the room. But even in the stillness, something stirred. The house pulsed. A slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat that never stopped. Time seemed to bend around it. The walls, once smooth and unyielding, shuddered with the slightest tremor. It was like the house was alive, aware of every movement, every breath. And then, a sound. A soft footstep. Barely perceptible. A shadow moved, slipping through the darkness. It was different from before. Not an echo of the past, but something new. Something unfamiliar. The figure in the room. Its form now a warped silhouette against the dim light. Stirred. It turned slowly, its head tilting as if listening. The air grew colder, its icy touch crawling under his skin, numbing him from the inside out. It was as though the very presence of the figure had changed. It was watching, waiting. The new presence continued to move, its steps hesitant, but purposeful. It was no longer an intruder, but a part of the house. Its form was only faintly visible, a silhouette in the edges of the room's glow. It was a reflection of what had come before. Yet different. New. The figure stepped closer to the center of the room, where the walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with its steps. The temperature dropped even more. The shadows stretched out unnaturally long, as though they were reaching, grasping, desperate. The new presence paused, its breath shallow, its heart racing. It could feel it now. The pull, the force of the house, like invisible chains wrapping around its limbs. It was too late to fight it. It had already begun. The whispers were louder now. A chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. Stay. The word was like a command, a plea, and the walls seemed to tremble with the sound. The figure reached out, touching the space around it, feeling the pulse of the house beneath its fingertips. It knew. It knew it was too late. It was already a part of it, just as the others had been. The cycle had begun again. And somewhere, deep in the house, in the shadows and the silence, the figure watched. Waiting. Watching for the next one to cross the threshold. The house was patient. It always had been. And it would never stop. The house trembled again. A shudder that ran deep through its walls. As if it was breathing. Alive with an insatiable hunger. The new presence in the room didn't move. But its eyes darted around, as if searching for an escape. But there was nothing. Nothing but the cold. And the suffocating darkness. The shadows continued to stretch, twisting unnaturally, their shapes no longer bound by the laws of reality. They curled like tendrils, reaching out toward the figure, hungry for the warmth of its soul. The whispers were louder now, the voices thick with anticipation. Stay. The word, once a gentle plea, was now a command, a force that pulled at the core of the figure, numbing it, dulling its resistance. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as though the very space around it was closing in. It could feel the pressure, the weight of the house pressing down, a silent promise that there would be no escape. The figure's breath came faster, its chest tight with fear. But no matter how hard it tried, its feet wouldn't move. It was frozen, trapped by an invisible force, held in place by the house's will. Then, from the far corner of the room, a new sound, a faint creak. The floorboards shifted. The room seemed to expand for a moment, as if the house itself was adjusting, allowing more space. A door that hadn't been there before appeared. Just a crack. A sliver of light spilling from the other side. The figure hesitated, its mind screaming to run. But its body refused to obey. The whispering grew louder. Come! Stay! It was a pull. A relentless, magnetic force that drew the figure toward the door. Every step it took felt like wading through thick mud. Each movement heavier than the last. The air becoming thick with the scent of decay. Of forgotten things. It reached the door. But as it opened wider, the figure's body froze once more. Beyond the door, nothing. Just a void. An endless stretch of dark nothingness. And yet, it could feel the pull. It could feel the house's hunger. Ravenous. Insatiable. The figure stepped forward. Just one step. And in that moment, the door slammed shut behind it. The room plunged back into darkness. And the whispers faded. But not completely. There was still a presence. A weight in the air. A promise. The house waited. Silent. Patient. For the next one to cross the threshold. It would always wait. It would always hunger. The darkness deepened, swallowing every trace of light. The air felt thick, like it was suffocating the very breath from the figure's lungs. It stood in the blackness, its senses straining, fingers trembling as they reached out into the unknown. But there was nothing to grasp. Nothing but the endless, oppressive void. The house whispered again. A low, guttural sound, like the wind moving through tight spaces. Stay! The word reverberated through the figure's bones. A sound that seemed to come from within, as if the house itself was speaking through it. The pull was stronger now. It was no longer just a suggestion. It was an imperative. A command. A promise of something darker. Something that could never be undone. The figure tried to move. Its legs felt like lead. Its arms refused to obey. It was trapped in place. A puppet with invisible strings. The darkness pressed in from all sides, as if the house was closing in on it. But it wasn't just the room that was shrinking. The walls were bending, warping, pulling everything toward the center, toward the core of the house, where the heartbeat echoed. Steady and unrelenting. The figure could feel it. The pulse of the house. It was alive. And it was hungry. Then a sound. A faint scraping. Like nails on wood. Scraping closer. The figure's heart began to race. It wanted to turn. Wanted to run. But there was no escaping the darkness. No escaping the house. The shadows wrapped around its legs. Like chains. Cold and biting. And then it saw it. A flicker in the darkness. A pair of eyes. Gleaming with that same, unnatural light. Empty. Soulless. Like the gaze of something long dead. The figure froze. The eyes grew closer. Their stare burning into its soul. The pull of the house grew stronger. Until it felt as though the very air was being ripped from its chest. It could feel its own essence being drained. Pulled into the blackness. Fed to the house's insatiable hunger. And then the whisper again. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command anymore. It was a declaration. Stay. The figure moved forward. It couldn't stop it. It couldn't resist. The door. The one it had passed earlier. It was open again. It beckoned. It called. And despite everything, despite the darkness closing in, the figure stepped through. The house groaned, its pulse quickening, as though it recognized the figure's surrender. A sharp, piercing sound echoed. The scream of the walls themselves. The house in agony. And then. Silence. The house was still. Waiting. For the next soul. For the next one to come. To feel the pull. It would always wait. And it would never stop. Backslash. The silence hung in the air. Heavy and thick. Nothing moved. The darkness remained. Filling every inch of the room. Seeping into every crevice of the house. But something was changing. Something was stirring beneath the surface. The walls trembled. A low, deep vibration that echoed through the floorboards. The house was awake again. The hunger had been satisfied for now. But it was not quenched. It never was. Far in the depths of the house, a door creaked open. Just a sliver. A faint light leaked through, casting a soft glow on the cracked wooden floors. It was nothing more than a flicker. But it was enough. A new presence stepped into the hallway. Its footsteps careful. Deliberate. It was different this time. The house was quiet. Still. Almost. Waiting. And yet. The air was charged. As if something unseen was watching. A shiver ran down the figure's spine. But it didn't stop. It couldn't. The hallway stretched out before it. Long and narrow. Ending in shadow. But the whisper was there again. Faint. Barely audible. But it was there. Stay. The figure's chest tightened. It knew. It understood the house's pull. But it had to fight it. It had to find a way out. With each step, the shadows grew thicker. Closer. Until it could barely see the floor beneath its feet. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. And the walls seemed to move. Shifting ever so slightly. Closing in around it. It reached the door. The one that had opened before. Its hand trembled as it reached for the handle. Turning it slowly. And then. A sharp, piercing screech. The door slammed shut before it could open. The figure stepped back. Its breath shallow. The panic rising in its chest. It could feel the house watching. Waiting. But the door didn't open again. The whispers grew louder. Closer. Stay. They were no longer just voices. They were part of the house. Part of the very air. And then, in the darkest corner of the hallway, something moved. A shadow. No. Not a shadow. A figure. The figure turned slowly. Its eyes wide. Empty. A faint glow emanated from the sockets, casting a pale, eerie light. It stepped forward. Its limbs stiff, unnatural. As though it had been waiting for this moment. The figure felt a chill run through its body. The weight of the house closing in. Its grip tightening. It knew what it had to do. But it couldn't stop. Not now. The presence before it stepped closer. Its hollow eyes fixed on the figure. It opened its mouth. But no sound came out. Instead, the whisper came again. Stay. The figure's body was no longer its own. It stepped forward. Against its will. Closer to the other presence. It knew what would happen. It knew it was too late to resist. And as the darkness swallowed it whole, the house waited. Silent. Alive. The shadows, once distant, now felt impossibly close. They twisted and curled like tendrils of some monstrous being. Reaching for it. Grasping. Pulling. The whispers, the endless, insistent whispers, grew louder. Their voices layered upon each other, drowning out every thought. Stay. Stay with us. The figure's breath caught in its throat. Its chest constricting. It tried to stop. To fight. But the house was too powerful. It was a force beyond understanding. Its hunger never ending. The figure stumbled forward. Dragged by an unseen force. Its hands trembling at its sides. Ahead, the door was open again. But this time, it wasn't just a crack. It was wide. Gaping. A portal into the heart of the house. a place where time itself seemed to bend. The figure felt the pull intensify, its body shaking with the weight of its decision. It wanted to turn away, to run, but it couldn't. The figure stepped inside, and instantly, the air was colder. The walls were slick with moisture, the floor wet and slick beneath its feet. The house exhaled a low, groaning sigh. It was alive. And it was feeding. It was feeding on the fear, on the confusion, on the essence of the figure. The room before it was vast, endless, a cavernous space that seemed to stretch into infinity. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, the walls lost in shadows, and then, there, in the center of the room, the figure saw it. A figure. Another one. A pale, ghostly form standing still in the center. Its back turned. The figure took a step forward, its feet moving without thought. And when it reached the other presence, it froze. The figure's reflection. It was staring back at it. But not its true reflection. No, this was something else. A twisted, hollow version of itself. A shadow of what it once was. And in that moment, the figure understood. The house wasn't just a prison. It wasn't just a place of torment. It was a mirror. A mirror that showed what had been, what was, and what could never be again. The figure reached out. Its fingers brushed against its reflection. But as soon as it touched the other form, it felt it. A jolt of raw, suffocating power. The reflection smiled. A twisted, cruel smile, its eyes gleaming with that same hollow emptiness. And then, the whisper returned, louder than ever. Stay. The figure was drawn in, pulled toward its reflection, toward the house's heart. It couldn't resist. Not anymore. And as the figure merged with its twisted reflection, the house sighed in satisfaction. It had claimed another. And as the darkness closed in, the house waited. Alive. Forever hungry. The air was thick now, heavy with the taste of finality. The house, satisfied for a moment, held its breath, as if it too was waiting. The darkness wrapped tighter around the figure, absorbing it, melding it with the very walls. The reflection, now one with the figure, dissolved into the shadows, vanishing from sight. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The house seemed to hold still, as though it was letting the weight of the new presence settle. But then, the floorboards creaked again. A new set of footsteps echoed down the hall. This time, soft and hesitant. A quiet tremor ran through the air. It was a new arrival. The house recognized it instantly. The whisper stirred once more. A faint rustling in the air. But louder this time. Stay. It echoed through the hallways, curling around the edges of the room. The house was alive again. Waiting. Hunger stirring at its core. The figure, the one just claimed, now part of the house, felt a shift. It could sense it. A presence. A life coming closer. There was no fear anymore. It had become something else. Part of the hunger. Part of the shadows that now swirled and shifted in the corners of the room. It wasn't alone. It would never be alone again. The house was full. Full of whispers. Full of memories. Full of the lost. The new arrival stopped at the threshold, the door hanging half open, as if the house had been expecting it. For a moment, the air felt almost still. Then, the figure stepped forward. Tentative. Uncertain. The house, patient as always, waited for the inevitable. The new soul would join the others. It would feel the pull, just as the others had before. It would hear the whispers, feel the darkness at its heels. The figure felt it first, the cold creeping into its bones. The shadows seemed to breathe, to stretch toward it, reaching, waiting. It could hear the whispers now. Clearer. Louder. Stay. The word rang in its ears. It wanted to run. It wanted to turn away. But the house had already chosen. The figure's feet moved forward. Slowly. As if it had no control over its own body. It was being drawn in. Drawn toward the heart of the house. And then, just like all the others, the door slammed shut behind it. The darkness consumed it. Swallowed it whole. The house sighed again. It was whole once more. The walls shifted slightly. Readjusting. The hunger settled. But only for a moment. The house was patient. Always waiting. And somewhere, deep within the labyrinth, the whispers began again. The call for another soul. Another life to feed the endless hunger. The door would always be open. And the house would always be hungry. The air shifted. Heavy with anticipation. The walls of the house creaked as if stretching. Settling in the new presence. It was almost as though the house was breathing. Expanding. Growing. The hunger had been fed. But it never truly ended. For a brief moment, everything felt still. Like the calm before the storm. But then, a tremor rippled through the floors. Vibrating up through the walls. The house reacting to its own hunger. The darkness deepened. Filling the corners of the room where shadows gathered like hungry predators. Waiting. Waiting for the next one. And then, footsteps again. Soft, cautious. A new figure. Moving through the house's hallways. Unaware of the fate that awaited it. The whispers followed. Faint at first. But growing louder. Stay. The voice had taken on a more insistent tone now. Like a subtle wind. Carrying with it the weight of centuries of hunger. The house could feel it. Sensed the newcomer's uncertainty. Its hesitation. It was always the same. Fear. Uncertainty. And then, the pull. The figure stopped. Hesitating at the edge of a darkened doorway. The faintest light just beyond it. The house had opened a new path. Just a crack. Just enough to beckon. The figure moved closer. Drawn in. Step by step. As if it had no control. Its feet unwillingly pushing forward. The whispers seemed to grow louder with each movement. Like voices pressing in from all sides. Stay. Join us. The words bled into the figure's thoughts. A command. A promise of something unknown. And then, it saw the door. The one that had been calling. The house had made it so inviting. Just a sliver of light. Just enough to spark curiosity. But the figure had no idea what it was stepping into. No idea what lay on the other side. It took another step. The air seemed to crackle with energy. The door swung open. And in that moment, the figure felt it. A wave of cold so sharp it stole its breath. The shadows in the room swelled. Reaching out. Grasping at its limbs. Pulling it toward the center. It tried to resist. But the house's grip was too strong. The figure's heartbeat raced. Pounding in its chest like thunder. It turned to flee. But the walls shifted. Closing in around it. Tightening like a vice. The door slammed shut. And with it, the last hope of escape. Stay. The voice was everywhere now. Echoing through every corner of the room. In every crevice of the house. There was no escape. Not anymore. The figure's body froze. No longer its own. As the darkness swallowed it whole. It became part of the house. Its essence feeding the hunger. Joining the whispers. Becoming the thing it had feared. And as the house settled. Its pulse steady and calm once more. The door was once again open. It would always be open. Always waiting for the next soul to cross the threshold. The house would never stop. It would never stop hunger. The house stood in silence once more. Its walls pulsing faintly. As though it had just taken a deep, satisfied breath. The darkness settled around the edges of the room. Thick and suffocating. But somewhere, beneath that silence, beneath the weight of the shadows. Something stirred. Something was moving again. The door remained ajar. An invitation. Unspoken, but undeniable. The faintest glow lingered in the crack, like the promise of something just beyond reach. And as the air grew heavier, more oppressive, another presence stepped closer. Footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway. Slow. Measured. It was a familiar sound. Another soul. Drawn toward the house's call. The whispers, once more, murmured in the air. Gentle at first, but slowly rising in volume. Growing insistent. Stay. Come closer. The figure paused at the threshold. It was aware now. Aware of the cold air. Aware of the unnatural quiet that surrounded it. It was different this time. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was alive. It was a force. The whispers grew louder, filling the figure's mind, drowning out everything else. The house had done this before. Over and over. And it would keep doing it. Feeding. Waiting. The hunger never stopped. The figure reached for the door, its hand trembling as it touched the cold handle. The door creaked open just a fraction, and the air seemed to rush in. Cold, heavy. But the darkness. It was deeper now. More intense. It was waiting. For the figure. For the next soul. And when the figure stepped inside, it felt it immediately. The house. Its pulse. Alive. It wrapped around the figure, like a blanket of shadows, pressing in from every side. The walls seemed to breathe, alive with the house's hunger. Stay. The voice was everywhere now, whispering through the darkness, through the walls, through the very air itself. It was suffocating. It was inevitable. The figure's body trembled as it was drawn deeper into the house, its legs moving as if on their own, as though the very space around it was controlling its every step. The shadows were closing in, swarming, reaching for it. There was no escape. The house had claimed its soul, just as it had with all the others. And then, a sharp, sudden pain. It was a shock to the figure's senses, as though its very essence was being torn from it. The walls groaned in response, shifting and creaking as the house absorbed the presence. The figure's body froze in place, its eyes wide with terror. But it was too late. The hunger had already taken hold. The whispers became a chorus now. Voices layered upon each other, each one speaking the same thing. Stay. And as the darkness consumed it, the house settled once more, its hunger satisfied. But only for a moment. The walls groaned, ready to take in the next soul, the next lost one to wander too close. The house would always be waiting. It would never stop. The house was still, its walls thick with the silence of something ancient, something alive. The darkness, impenetrable, hung in the air, a suffocating weight that clung to every surface. But beneath that silence, something stirred. A subtle shift. A movement in the shadows. A breath taken, then released. Soft, almost imperceptible. Another soul had wandered too close. The whispers began again. Faint at first, but growing louder. Stay. It was a command. A pull that wrapped around the new presence. Tugging, drawing it in. The figure, unaware of the fate that awaited, paused at the entrance. The door stood ajar. A crack of light spilling from within. Inviting. Tempting. It was always the same. A call that could not be ignored. The house groaned in response, its pulse quickening. The figure stepped closer, drawn by something unseen, something irresistible. It reached out, fingers brushing the doorframe. And with that simple touch, the house exhaled a low, guttural sigh of satisfaction. The door swung open, and in that moment, the air shifted. Cold. Thick. It rushed toward the figure, pushing against its skin like icy fingers. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp, twisting, slithering around the edges of the room. Stay! The voice was louder now. Closer. A command, clear and final. The figure stepped forward, its heart racing. But it was no longer in control. The house had claimed it. And with every step, it was pulled deeper into the darkness. The walls began to close in, their oppressive weight pressing against the figure's chest. It could feel the eyes of the house, watching, waiting. The whispers rose, almost deafening now. Stay! Join us! The figure's legs trembled. But it couldn't stop. Its body was no longer its own. It had crossed the threshold. It was already part of the house. And as the darkness swallowed it whole, the house sighed once more. Its hunger momentarily stilled. But it would never end. The door would always remain open, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, to hear the whispers, to fall into its embrace. And the house would always hunger. The house settled once again, its pulse steady, quiet, as though it had never moved. The door creaked softly, then fell silent. Outside, the world carried on, unaware of the house's ever-present hunger. The darkness in the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the very life of the house itself. But the hunger was still there, waiting, patient, in the center of the room. The figure, now a part of the house, stood still, not as it had once been, but as something new, twisted, absorbed into the very essence of the place. It could feel the house's heartbeat, pulsing in rhythm with its own. It could feel the whispers, the faint tug of others who would come, lost, drawn into the same trap. But there was no escape anymore. It was a part of the house, just as the others had become. And it would never be whole again. The darkness embraced it, wrapped around it like a comforting shroud. The hunger was always there. But it was no longer a force to fear. It had become a part of the figure's own nature. The house was no longer just a place. It was an entity, alive with the souls it had claimed, feeding on them, growing stronger with each passing moment. And though the figure now existed in the house, it still felt the pull of the door, of the whispers, of the hunger that never ceased. Outside, the world carried on. The sun set, the wind whispered through the trees, but the house remained, waiting, alive. It would always wait. For the next one. For the next soul to wander too close. To hear the whispers. To open the door. And so the cycle would continue. The house, its hunger never ending. Always watching. Always waiting. The door would never close. It would always be open. Inviting. Waiting for the next to step inside. And the house would always hunger.